Och jag ska snart presentera kvällens utländska gäst och då kommer det handla om kriminaljournalistik. Och ni kanske undrar hur jag fick jobbet på Veckans brott. Det var väl helt enkelt så att jag klarade förhöret hos Leif. Och det var en ganska annorlunda anställningsintervju med frågor som jag aldrig fått tidigare. Han undrade bland annat vad jag skulle ta med mig om han och jag skulle ut i skogen och leta efter ett lik. Och det enda vettiga jag kom på var ju gummistövlar. Och då nickade professorn mycket belåtet. Och jag insåg att jag faktiskt hade fått jobbet. Och då var det i och för sig en hel del ögonbryn som höjdes på folk i Radiohuset när jag berättade då att jag skulle lämna radion efter 17 år och börja sända kriminalprogram. Jaha, du ska göra pang-pang-tv du, var ju kommentarer man fick då. Det är väl sånt som kvällspressen håller på med. Jag menar snaskare i brott och säljer lösnummer på folks lidande. Och nu ska alltså public service göra det. Intressant. Och det har jag i och för sig förstått i efterhand att det var lite nervöst där i chefskorridorerna till en början. Men nu har vi väl en självklar plats i tablån. Och jag har börjat intressera mig inte bara för polisens arbete utan även för kriminalreportrars arbete. And that's why I'm especially happy to introduce to you tonight Mr. Duncan Campbell.
Thanks very much.
He is one of the most well-known and respected crime reporters in Britain. He works for The Guardian and he has been working for the BBC. And you've written several books on crime. And let's start from the beginning. How old were you when you started to work as a crime reporter?
In my early 20s. Can I just say it's a real pleasure to be here because when the journalist prize giving ceremonies in Britain are completely opposite to this. People boo journalists from other papers, and a couple of years ago there was actually a fight on stage and blood. So it's very touching to see how supportive everybody is. Anyway, maybe later. We need to have some crime.
Surprise him later, yeah? Yeah. Okay. I'll take my first question again.
Right.
Yeah. How long have you been working as a crime reporter?
It's about 45 years, something like that.
Oh.
I mean, and it's I've always been fascinated by it, and it's and there's never any shortage of stories.
And how was it in those days when you began?
Well, it was very different. Strangely enough, in the 60s and 70s in Britain, the police were incredibly corrupt. And in fact, the head of police who came into Scotland Yard in 1970 said it was his ambition to arrest more criminals than he employed. But the weird thing about it was that the relations between the press and the police were very cozy, and too many journalists were too close to the police, and therefore the corruption never came out. And now we're in the opposite situation where the relations between the police and the press are extremely strained, and actually the detectives are much cleaner than they were 40 years ago.
Okay. The Guardian revealed the phone hacking affair more than 2 years ago, and right now the trial is going on against the journalists and former editors.
Yes.
How big is this scandal in Britain?
It's enormous. I mean, there's been a deterioration in terms of people being interested in trials in Britain, but now with this, there's 70 journalists covering it, and it's kind of like getting into Wimbledon for a journalist to get a ticket to it, and it is extraordinary. It's being covered as heavily as the trial of a serial killer. And I noticed that in Sweden you have, I think, 4 empty prisons or something like that. So it may be that with all the journalists standing trial at the moment, there'd be a possibility of filling them at the end of this.
How many journalists have been arrested?
61 have been arrested so far. 25 have been charged, 4 have pleaded guilty, and 12 have been told that they won't be charged.
That's unbelievable.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
And the sad and I think terribly depressing thing is that what they are accused of, and some have pleaded guilty, what they were doing was not seeking to expose, like some of the prize winners tonight, appalling things and scandals and corruption. They were seeking to expose whether Sven-Göran Eriksson was having an affair with somebody, or somebody's girlfriend was having an affair with a politician. It was all kind of for pointless stuff that was maybe of public interest, but is in no way was in the public interest. And I think that's the depressing thing for British journalists at the moment, is to find that this is what we're famous for around the world, is for being obsessed with celebrity and using any kind of techniques to get pointless stories about people's sexual peccadillos.
And journalists also stands accused of bribing the police to get information. How common is that in the UK?
It's been against the law since 1906, but it has been very. I have to say, The Guardian never pays for stories, and the only person who's ever asked me for money was a judge, actually. So I have never personally paid a police officer for a story. But it is quite common.
But what happened with the judge, I wonder?
I didn't pay him.
No?
Yeah. And he's dead now anyway, so he can't deny it.
But did you get any information?
Yeah.
You did?
Yes.
All right.
But the thing about the payment is that, again, because of the fascination with celebrity in Britain at the moment, if anybody famous is drunk or is arrested, or that more often if there's a tragedy, a death or something like that, an officer would then quite often phone a former officer who was working maybe for the News of the World or something like that, who acted as the middleman, and that was how the deals were done. Sometimes for quite small amounts of money, £300, £400. Sometimes if it was a big story and it was somebody very famous, then they would be paying more. And that's what some of the trials that will be coming up over the next few months will involve, those payments.
But how common is that in the UK?
It's not an everyday event, but it has been happening. And Rupert Murdoch had a meeting for all his Sun journalists who are facing trial earlier this year. I'm sure you've heard about it. And it was a case of the bugger bugged, as it were, because 2 of his journalists recorded what went on. And he said, after all, it's ridiculous that you're all being arrested because people have been doing this for years and everybody knows that everybody does it. So it's quite interesting that even he was saying that it was just, it's just a little thing that you pay police officers for money.
How could you be so successful without using your competitors' methods?
Well, there's a lot of very wonderful and very straight police officers in Britain who are perfectly happy to pass things on. There's it's a minority. I shouldn't paint too horrible a picture, but it is a minority that were in it for the money, and still are, some of them.
As a result of this scandal, investigator Brian Levison has proposed tougher regulation for the media. What do you think about that?
Well, I don't think they're doing it. It was inevitable, I think, because there was such a scandal about the way in which people had been hacked and bugged and everything, that something had to happen. And the new system, I think I was talking to some of your colleagues last night about the system that you have here, which seems a much more sensible one than we have at the moment. But what they're trying to introduce is a system whereby anyone who's abused in the papers and the paper has got it wrong has a chance to go to arbitration, and if the paper has behaved very badly, then they can be fined up to £1 million. Who knows whether it would work properly? It's not been tested like that. What is worse in England are our libel laws. I expect some of you have come across them. And they're a much greater worry to somebody writing about crime.
Why? Why?
Well, I speak from having been sued by 8 police officers, and we won, I'm glad to say, thanks to being supported by Alan Rusbridger, the wonderful editor of The Guardian, who has the essential thing for an editor, which is a spinal column. And I'm sure there are many editors here with that, but it's been terrific to have him involved in the hacking and in the Snowden case, which we'll talk about, to have that backing, and I had his backing on that. But a lot of police officers will sue, even although they're not mentioned in a story, on the grounds that their mother read it and thought it might refer to them, or their wife read it and thought it might refer to them. So if you're writing a story about police corruption and you say an officer from a squad in northeast London who has just been transferred, if he can then go to the lawyers and say, my mother thought this journalist was referring to me, they would then sue. And the Police Federation, our police union, used that form of libel, and we won in The Guardian won in our case, and it was the first time we'd won in 95 libel actions brought by the police against crime reporters.
How has the relationship between police officers and media changed after this phone hacking scandal?
It's very, very chilly at the moment. They don't like to be seen even having a conversation with you. And there's Sky Television in Britain, Martin Brunt, who's the crime correspondent there. If you ever watch Sky, you'll see him standing outside Scotland Yard and that sign that revolves behind him. And he normally would stop people and interview them. And he says that now as they come past, they go like that, as though, you know, I can't be seen talking to you. It's got that absurd. And this is there's a thing called the Crime Reporters Association in England, which has a lovely little tie with crossed I was going to say cufflinks, handcuffs and a quill pen. And they have a drink every year for police officers, detectives, press officers, and so on. And they've cancelled it this year because only 2 people came last year because the police are so terrified to be seen sitting down and having a drink. And they've now been encouraged to report any journalistic contact that they have. So if you go for a drink with a detective on something, you
have to report it to your boss, or
the police have to report it to their boss.
To their boss.
And they pat you down to see if you're wired up.
Okay, yeah. And how has this affair affected the status of crime reporters?
Well, I don't know. I mean, journalists. I don't know if there's a famous old poem from the 1920s which goes. You cannot hope to bribe or twist, thank God, the British journalist, but seeing what the man will do unbribed, there really is no reason to. And I think a lot of people feel like that about British journalists at the moment. I don't know if you have these polls here when the most popular professions in the public, always at the top are doctors, firefighters, and nurses in Britain, and always at the bottom, we've just been joined by the bankers, actually, recently, but always at the bottom are politicians, lawyers, estate agents, and sadly journalists. So this whole business has also had that effect.
I know you think it's important for crime reporters to have contacts among both cops and criminals.
Yeah.
And last spring, you arranged the funeral for the well-known burglar and thief, Peter Scott.
Yes.
And wasn't that a pretty odd thing to do?
I don't do it a lot,
reporter?
yes. I don't organize criminals' funerals on a regular basis. But he was a strange character, Peter Scott. He appears in a film called He Who Rides a Tiger, and he stole about £30 million worth of jewels and Picassos. His last job was a Picasso when he was well into his 70s. It's encouraging that older people, they're still working in this way. He ended up going away for it. And he used to be called a master criminal, described as a master criminal, and he said a better description would be a master idiot. And he ended up penniless, and I knew him, well over the years, and because he'd fallen out with all of his four ex-wives and his children, and he ended up with a little bit of Alzheimer's. In fact, he could spot old criminals in the garden in the care home where he ended up, and the care home didn't want to bury him, and the local council didn't. So we ended up, and we had a funeral, and we played. There's a lovely gospel song called "Steal Away." You may know it. "Steal away with Jesus." It goes, "Steal away." So as his coffin went into the crematorium, we had "Steal Away," and we thought that was the most appropriate. And I have his ashes still, and we're going to take them to one of the galleries where he relieved them of a few places, I think, before.
Okay. I don't know what you say, but you look very different from the pictures we are used to see of the reporter Duncan Campbell.
The person who pretends to be Duncan Campbell. Yeah, that's right. I know, it's very confusing.
There are two of you.
Well, if you go to the west coast of Scotland, you'll find there's about 25,000 of us.
Okay,
it's one of those very common names, but we both happen to end up in the same...
As well-known reporters.
In that same sort of... And he in fact once got arrested by these officers from a corrupt police station who thought that he was me, and he was very indignant. He phoned me up the following day and asked why I had been writing these horrible stories.
Yeah. But you are the crime reporter, and let's talk about The Guardian. The Guardian was the first newspaper that published the information from Snowden.
Yes.
And which led to strong actions from authorities. And you can hardly believe what happened in the basement at The Guardian in the past summer.
Yes, with the GCHQ, General Communications Headquarters, which is this big hub that I'm sure many of you have read about, that listens to every single telephone call you make and makes a note of it. Not quite, but that's the hub that has relations with the National Security Agency in America. And The Guardian, after we published the initial stuff, having checked a lot of it, and we're talking about less than 1% of what Snowden provided, and it was all redacted, and the names of anybody who might be identified were removed. Two people from GCHQ came to The Guardian and said, well, you've had your fun, now we'd like the stuff back. And they said you either have to destroy it or hand it back. And Alan Rusbridger decided it was better to destroy it in case there was stuff on it that might be used in prosecuting Edward Snowden. So I wasn't present, and sadly I don't think The Guardian filmed it, but because we could have sold off bits of the hard drive. But the hard drive was actually destroyed in the basement in... they're quite difficult to destroy, I think. I don't know if any of you have got suspicious secrets that you had to smash, but anyway, that's what happened to it.
But does The Guardian get support from other British newspapers?
No, it's been dreadful. They've been pathetic, and The Sun, The Times, The Mail have suggested that the Sun had a story saying Guardian treason helps terrorists was the headline in it. The Mail, some Conservative politicians have been suggesting that The Guardian be charged with treason. It's pathetic. I mean, compared to the solidarity, which I get the impression exists between journalists here, it's partly because all the Murdoch papers and the Times and the Sun are so angry with The Guardian for exposing hacking there that
so it's a revenge then?
It's a very, very petty revenge. It's like the fighting on the stage. It's a different version of it.
One last thing I have to ask you, because this is the closest I will get to the famous actress Julie Christie. How did you two fall in love?
Well, it's not very... you could ask a few million other men. It's very easy. I had a birthday party, and somebody who knew her invited her, and one thing led to another.
Okay. And how does she like journalists?
She likes some journalists, I think, but she's extremely critical of the British press. I'm sure she would love the Swedish press, and she's very envious that she's not here. But anyway, I'm sure she would be much happier. But she grew up at a time. She was famous, particularly in the 60s and 70s, when the press was much gentler in Britain and much less kind of determined to cause damage and pain to people in the rather sadistic way that some of our tabloids go about it now.
Yeah. Give my best regards to her.
Yeah, sure.
And thank you very much for joining us.
It was a pleasure. Thank you very much.